So yesterday we talked about just a few of the critics of the New Deal, some specific, big personalities, people like Huey Long. And we also talked about how the Supreme Court stood in the way of a lot of New Deal programs, declaring unconstitutional several of them, including that National Recovery Administration that we talked about a few days before. So now we're going to look at the second round of the second phase of New Deal reform, which often gets called the second New Deal. So, and Roosevelt gets started on this. It's any of the New Deal programs that are passed between around 1935 and 36, and that's kind of flexible as far as the dates there. And some of this comes after Roosevelt wins re-election to a second term. He takes the fact that he is reelected despite certain criticisms as a mandate that people were supportive of the New Deal. They wanted him to continue with more reforms. And he also has an agenda here of sort of rescuing the New Deal from some of those challenges, rescuing it from the challenges that the Supreme Court has posed, and making sure that things are put in place and that they're able to stay in place in the long term. The second New Deal, overall, the goal shifted a little bit. So overall, the programs, some of them are quite similar, with similar goals. But overall, Roosevelt's focus with the second phase of New Deal programs is more about reform, more about long-term goals, meeting long-term goals. So a little bit less on immediate relief. The first New Deal dealt more with immediate relief to people that were suffering and trying to alleviate some of the worst of that suffering. Whereas the focus here is more on economic recovery, on getting things moving once again, and putting in place those safeguards and different things to make sure that this didn't happen again. Whether that was regulating the economy, regulating businesses, but really more so about not so much regulation, but safeguards in place for individuals, protections, so that when there was unemployment, when there was an economic crisis, that people would not just be completely destitute. So it's about those long-term things, long-term stability, long-term changes, and security for society, security for particularly those that were most vulnerable to economic downturns and those kind of things. So we're going to see continued employment programs, more banking regulations, different things to protect against those hazards, those things that are inevitably going to happen in life, in which people's income or people's livelihood might be affected, to try to safeguard some of those things so that people would not be destitute because of old age or because of illness or because they were unemployed or things like that. So there's kind of a second initiation of New Deal program, sort of a second win for it, a second 100 days, as it were, where Congress once again is pretty much giving Roosevelt a lot of what he wants, and there's a lot of rapid changes and reforms. One of these is another job creation program, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. This one was mentioned in some of the video segments that we watched yesterday. So this is, again, an employment program, similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps, similar to the Civil Works Administration, and a few others, where they are employing people. The government is employing people via this agency, and this employs millions of Americans. I think this is one of the largest of the employment programs that they used during the New Deal, employing them to do all sorts of public works projects. There are tons of things that the WPA was involved in and that they hired people to do, hiring laborers to build highways, to build buildings. There were lots of government buildings, schools and courthouses and other kind of public facilities, parks. We saw some of the clips yesterday, a lot of the work being done in the Dust Bowl area to revitalize those areas were done by the Works Progress Administration. Dams, any other kind of, sometimes they're, conservation, even kind of things still going on. And the Works Progress Administration, even one thing that made it a little bit unique was there was even a division of the Works Progress Administration that was employing artists and writers and musicians and putting them to work in something. So as well as building these buildings, there were lots of Works Progress Administration projects to like paint murals and things like that on the sides of buildings and to write music to kind of cheer people up. And that's one of the things that made it unique and unusual. One of the things that also caused a lot of people to criticize it, to say that all this work that they were employing people to do was frivolous. You know, they were employing people to do things that didn't need to be done. And then it was overkill, you know, and too much spending, and once again, not part of the government's role. These two pictures you see here, these are two examples of Works Progress Administration artwork, and there's been a lot of attempts over the past several decades to try to preserve what's left of it, because there are still a lot of them around, but a lot, of course, that have been removed or deteriorated and those kind of things. But these are just a few examples of some of the artwork that was done by WPA artists that were hired. Roosevelt wanted to include artists as well, and those were people that needed to make a living also. And other previous employment programs would not have included those kinds of people. It employs, again, millions of people, probably about 3 million people employed by the WPA. But once again, only taking a tiny, tiny little bite out of the unemployment problem. Now, it's in the New Deal. We have talked on and on and on and on so many times, it feels, just to an exhaustive point, really, about the problems of labor and workers and labor unions trying to get, you know, various things. We talked about how in the progressive era, workers did secure, at least for a while, certain things like minimum hours and maximum hours, minimum wages, and more protections. And that's something that workers, industrial laborers, have been working for ever since the beginnings of industrialization. It is in the New Deal where labor finally gets some lasting reforms and lasting changes. You know, they kind of almost made it halfway at state level in some cases during the progressive era, but a lot of that had been overturned. So workers are helped a lot by several landmark New Deal legislations, including the Wagner Act. This is probably one of the most significant pieces of labor legislation ever. Kind of a crowning jewel for labor unions, giving them finally some of the things that, again, they have been working for over a century. The Wagner Act basically gave workers the right to unionize, the right to form unions. That sounds very simple and basic, but that had been one of the key things that labor unions had been working for ever since the 1800s, was simply the right to exist. And while some states had offered those kind of protections, you didn't have a federal law to that effect. They gave workers the right to form unions and to say that those were legal, that those were not conspiracies, and that workers could not be penalized or punished for just being involved in a union. We've seen that happen, you know, in the past, where employers might refuse to hire people that were involved in unions or not negotiate with unions and all of that. It also gives them the right to bargain collectively, collective bargaining, meaning to, to negotiate with their employer as a union, and to force for employers, to deal with a labor union as a group. That was something that a lot of employers refused to do. They said, well, don't deal with a union, I'll deal with an individual person, but the group does not exist to me. I don't recognize that as a legal entity that I have to discuss anything with. But the Wagner Act gave them that right. So labor unions could not be declared illegal. Employers had to, negotiate with labor unions. They can't interfere with union activity, so they can't try to sabotage it. They can't try to spy on it. All those kind of things to inhibit those kind of things. It does include regulations. So there is a regulatory board included in this to regulate union activity and to monitor union activity to make sure that they also are not doing illegal things or scheming and doing stuff like they're trying to sabotage or whatever. But it provides some kind of way to regulate that whole process. So the Wagner Act gives labor unions those essential things that they have been striving for quite some time, including just the right to be a union and the right to function and work together to get the changes that they wanted. Probably one of the more recognizable of your New Deal reforms is the Social Security Act. This one's probably more familiar to a lot of us. We hear about Social Security a lot, whether we listen to the news or we know we have Social Security numbers. This will explain why we have that. And this whole concept was not a new concept. A lot of other countries already used this prior to the United States adopting it. The Social Security provided old age pensions, retirement pension for all workers. So old age pension or retirement pension for people over the age of 65. And it's paid for, of course, with payroll taxes. So some of that, those of you that have a part-time job, you've seen things get taken out of your paycheck. Part of that is Social Security. That's going into Social Security that you will get when you turn 65. Now, this was meant originally by Roosevelt not to be your sole income, not to be, the only thing, that people would have to get by on when they were retired, but, to supplement that, to supplement their income so they would have a little bit more money to spend. That might encourage more people to retire if they knew they have this pension coming in. And that way, more people would leave the workforce, thus opening up more jobs for younger workers. So that was kind of part of the idea behind it. But also to make sure that just being older and being retired wasn't going to put you at greater risk for, financial distress whenever there was some kind of economic, calamity or some kind of problem, that people would have a little bit of cushion. People could retire more comfortably. People could have some more money to spend. And it's encouraging people to spend money to get the economy moving once again. This also sets up unemployment insurance for states to handle. It's not a federal thing, but gives money to states for unemployment benefits. So this is where unemployment, people talk about filing unemployment. A lot of people, of course, have to do that past 6-7 months. A lot of that comes from Social Security, again, paid for by payroll taxes. So employers pay some of that. Some of that comes out of people's individual paychecks. But that way, if there is a, business fails, that sort of thing, people would have some kind of unemployment benefit to kind of tie them over until, they could get another job or things improve. So trying to put in these safeguards so that if there were future economic depressions, there would be some kind of a safety net. There's just a basic social safety net for all people, for all workers, not just some of them, not just the ones that can afford to put away tons of money, but that everybody has this sort of safety net in place. This also provided benefits for, people that were disabled, people that were able to work because of illness or injury or physical handicap. All those kind of things come from Social Security. Now, Social Security, the retirement stuff, that's federal. That's why you have a Social Security number. That's how the government identifies you and enrolls you in this system. The unemployment benefits, the, disability benefits, those kind of things, if you're curious, it's federal money, but then it goes to the states, and the states distribute that how they want. So that's a little bit different. So that's why it'll differ from state to state what those employments might be, and some things may not cover them, or some, professions may not be covered and stuff like that. So it's relatively conservative, actually, compared to the way a lot of European countries did it, and still do it, where the funding comes directly out of government revenues and not out of payroll taxes and things like that. And at first, Social Security did not include everybody. At first, it didn't include farmers. It didn't include domestic workers, like people's maids or something like that, a lot of which were African American. So that's going back to how minorities were oftentimes not as affected or not as well protected by some of the New Deal programs. But that is certainly one of the lasting results of the New Deal, one of the programs that's still, very important to a lot of people, and one of the ones that comes up in the conversation a lot, concerns about funding it, concerns about running out of money and all those kinds of things, and people relying on that. So next I want to look at kind of the, as it says here, twilight of the New Deal, kind of the last gasp of it, where it starts to become a little bit less successful in getting things done, where programs start to come a bit more sparsely, and where more criticism starts to come in and it becomes more difficult for Roosevelt to continue pushing this program for a number of reasons. One roadblock we mentioned the other day to the New Deal was the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court had declared several things unconstitutional, and there were several other cases pending in the court and a lot of other New Deal programs that were hinging on the court's decision. So Roosevelt decides to try to get around this, because again, he wins re-election in 1936. He assumes that that means people want him to continue with New Deal reforms, that they're on his side. And he sees the Supreme Court as being in the way. And so Roosevelt came up with this proposal, and this doesn't actually happen, but he came up with this proposal to add justices to the Supreme Court. He brings this proposal to ask Congress. The president can't change the size of the court. Only Congress can do that. I think Congress can do it, though. He's basically asking Congress to increase the size of the court to allow him to appoint new justices, because who gets to appoint justices? Only the president does. So saying, hey, increase it. Specifically, he wanted like a new justice for every judge sitting on the court that was over the age of 70, because they were all, Roosevelt called them the 9 old men. They were older, they were more conservative, and they were not very welcoming. They were pretty hostile towards New Deal programs. So, but the president can't get rid of any of those justices. Remember, they're there for life. The president cannot remove anybody, can't fire anybody. You know, they're there until they die or they retire. So what Roosevelt was trying to do was to make the court bigger, ask Congress to increase the size of it, and allow him, that would give him the chance to appoint some new people. And obviously, Roosevelt, if he had been able to do this, what kind of people would he have appointed? People that were what? That were going to be, more sympathetic to New Deal programs. And if he had done this, and if he had done it the way that he originally wanted, it would have been adding like 6 justices, I think, to the Supreme Court, sitting at about 15, which was pretty high. And the court has varied in size, but it's been 9 for a real long time. And this blows up into a big, scandal is not the right word, but, a big controversy. There we go. Becomes a big controversy. And people refer to this and label it as he's court packing, that he's trying to pack the court with pro-New Dealer, pro-Roosevelt people, just so he can get his programs through. If you've heard that phrase, court packing, you pay attention to the news. It's come up in the past couple of weeks. But this is where that word came from. It came from Roosevelt's attempt at to get the court bigger to support the New Deal. But this is where Roosevelt really did certainly go a little too far. This is where even his own party said, oh, no, that is way too much. So even Democrats cried foul at this. And so that was way too controversial. That was way too political. That was an abuse of power. That's not what the president's ability to, appoint justices was meant for. It was not meant to manipulate the court in a certain direction so that they could get certain things done. So certainly conservatives were appalled at it. But even the Democrats were starting to become very divided over it. And Congress certainly says no. So they wouldn't support it. So obviously it doesn't happen. And it becomes probably the biggest blunder of FDR's career, probably the bigger mistake that he makes, and causes more people to kind of pull away from New Deal programs. The odd thing, though, even though this didn't work and it actually causes Roosevelt to lose some support, he starts to divide the Democratic Party. It starts to kind of eat away at the support for the New Deal in general and support for Roosevelt in general, because people felt like this was excessive and a power grab, as a more modern phrase might put it. In the end, the whole issue between Roosevelt and the courts and the New Deal and the courts kind of works out on its own. Because after this, the court just starts to become more sympathetic to the New Deal anyway. They kind of change and reverse course on some of those things. They end up actually upholding a lot of stuff that things like Social Security, for example, the court reviewed those and approved them. One of those really conservative justices ended up retiring, and Roosevelt was able to appoint someone that was far more sympathetic to New Deal reform, someone from Alabama, actually, see who he appoints. And so in the end, it kind of works out in Roosevelt's favor, although it did cost him a lot of support and therefore kind of causes the New Deal itself to lose some steam and slow down and all of that. Another thing that causes the New Deal to lose steam and to lose some, again, I don't want to say support as in everybody just quits supporting it, but we won't see it really being initiated and being pursued all that much, was there was a bit of a recession by 1937. The economy just started to slump again. Things had been improving, not at an astronomical rate. It had been slow. But then in 1937, you see a bit of a slump, and unemployment starts to rise up again. There's a slump in the output of the economy. It just kind of starts to stall and to stall out a little bit. And they're able to reverse it. Congress, or Roosevelt asked Congress for more spending bills, more projects, more stuff, and that does reverse it. But even though it reversed that recession, it certainly slowed down the New Deal as a whole when you have this kind of economic downturn. Not a huge one, certainly not getting back to where they were prior to the New Deal being enacted to begin with, but it did kind of slow down support for the New Deal by that point. Also by 1937, things are starting to get kind of scary in Europe, and that was distracting a lot of people as well. So support for the New Deal, and the New Deal is fading, certainly by 1937, 1938. Probably one of the last really meaningful New Deal reforms was the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This one also a big win for labor, where they also get some of the big things that they have been seeking for a long time. So this established the minimum wage. This established or banned child labor. Provided, maximum hours or laws about people can only work so long before overtime or other kinds of benefits had to be paid. So some of those basic benefits like shorter hours and higher pay and no child labor and protections like that once again, we have been talking about workers striving for those things forever. They finally get in the New Deal that will last, and those things have been in place ever since then. So like I said, by 1938 or so, it's not like they ever say the New Deal's done, it's over, we're not doing it anymore. It's not like that. But it's becoming harder to get these things through. The public's a little more distracted. The reaction's a bit more mixed. Democrats are far more divided. When this whole thing got started, they were 100% behind Roosevelt no matter what he wanted. That's not the case anymore. And so the New Deal just kind of stalls. It sort of stalemates, and it's kind of not really going much of anywhere by 1938, certainly by 1939. Also by 1938, 1939, what we'll look at tomorrow, as I said a moment ago, the situation in Europe was getting very distracting to a lot of Americans, certainly with the lead up to and then the outbreak of World War II by 1939. That became something that a lot of people had concerns about, even though at that point the stance was the United States would stay out of it. It was still something that a lot of people were watching and nervous about and had a lot of interest in. So to wrap up, we're just going to talk about sort of the overall legacy of the New Deal. What were some of the things that it did change? What are some of the things that it did do? What are some of the questions that it still raised? We're going to look at first at two different views of this, sort of how critics of the New Deal, because the New Deal today is still an incredibly polarizing thing. Some people still look at the New Deal as a monumental achievement that set in place so many important reforms for whatever reason. And then there are those that think this is just, the absolute devil. And one of the worst things that ever happened. It's an incredibly polarizing thing. So just very, very generally, people that criticized the New Deal, kind of their overall thoughts of it and why they may have criticized it. And there's, various routes people might have gone with this. But critics may have argued that it was wasteful, that it was just spending, and irresponsible, fiscally irresponsible. They were just wasting money, that it was incompetent, confused, contradictory. And it was contradictory. There was times when we're spending and then we pull it back, or we're going to try this, and then nope. But that was, always sort of Roosevelt's approach to it, was just try whatever and see what happens. And a lot of critics were nervous about that, shocked by that, disturbed by Roosevelt's what seemed like recklessness to them of a, leap before you look kind of a philosophy. Let's just go for it, and then whatever happens, happens, and we'll deal with it there. They accused Roosevelt of not only being reckless and being irresponsible, but of sort of confusing just doing something with doing something well, that he was just doing stuff to say, so that he could say, look what we did, we passed this law, this law, this law, this law, but not very concerned with how effective that was, and did it actually work, confusing just making noise with actually making progress and actually doing something that was going to be helpful. A lot of folks real concerned with the government assistance, and the idea or worry that this had created or was going to create people or a mentality that you could not work, or you could fall on hard times, but you don't need to save your money, you don't need to worry about this because the government's going to take care of you. We'll give you a job, we'll give you this. Great concern that this was destroying that individualism, that individual spirit, that spirit of pull yourself up, the spirit of make something of yourself, work hard, all those sorts of things that have been such a part of the American narrative for such a long time. Fear that it destroyed that this was borderlining on socialism, that it was communist, some really extreme views, that it was a very extreme program, that it was far too radical, that it was destroying capitalism. This was destroying, everything the United States was built upon. And there is the fact that it does not solve the Depression. It helps it. It does move it along. It does perhaps prevent it from getting worse. But it did not solve the unemployment problem. That was not solved by 1938-39 when the New Deal was pretty much over and done with. It did not bring it, a close in that gap between consumption and production. It's not until World War II that happens. However, some would argue that not that it was not doing that it did too much, but that it wasn't doing enough. That they didn't put enough into it to make that happen, because World War II, does finally bring the United States economy back to full employment, but that was a much more massive amount of government spending than the New Deal ever thought about. So a lot of folks would argue that they just weren't doing it enough. They weren't initiating enough government spending to get things moving again. Didn't rack up a big of enough of a debt, because the debt at the end of World War II is significantly higher than it was at the end of the New Deal. Now, the New Dealers, that meaning people in favor of the New Deal, that supported the New Deal, they would argue various things like, well, yeah, maybe there was some waste. There were things that didn't work. But that wasn't the point. That the point was relief. The point was to get people out of that despair that they were in. It was to alleviate the worst of the suffering. And they would argue that they were successful in doing that they were able to reach millions of people. There were people that, didn't starve to death because of the New Deal. There were people that had some sort of income because of the New Deal. And, that's certainly true for a handful of folks. You heard some of the people on the video we were watching yesterday said we wouldn't have had no way had it not been for some of these programs. So, there's certain people that did benefit from them, and the New Dealers would have said that makes it worth it. We were able to do that. If anything, to let people know that, their government hadn't given up on them, and that somebody cared about them, and that they were not going to just be left to starve because of a situation that was beyond their control. And they would argue that this did, this did help the worst of it. While maybe it didn't 100% fix it, that it did prevent it from getting worse. It did prevent the economy from being on total collapse, and prevented it from going down in probably a more dangerous direction. They would argue that, whereas the critics would say this was destroying capitalism, the supporters of the New Deal would argue that it really saved capitalism, that it saved it from some of its worst abuses, that it, reformed the system so that in a way where capitalism is still intact, but you're preventing, with some of the labor laws, for example, extreme abuse of workers and things that might have, caused more radical ideas to take over had you not been able to sort of save capitalism from itself and to restrict it and reform it in such a way where it works a little bit better, for everybody, not just for the people, at the top of the economic ladder. But another thing we can certainly say about the New Deal, whether people think it's a good thing or a bad thing, the New Deal does fundamentally and forever change the scope, meaning the size and the extent, the expanse of the federal government and the role of the federal government. What do you suppose happens to the size of the federal government as a result of the New Deal? It increases by a long shot. There are so many federal agencies, jobs, offices, regulatory agencies, and so forth that exist after the New Deal that didn't beforehand. There are thousands of government employees or government jobs after the New Deal that weren't there before, and that continues to grow. Obviously, some people think that's a bad thing, or that it eventually gets too much, so forth and so on. But whether you think it's good or bad, no, value judgment on that. The United States government is significantly larger and significantly more powerful as a result of the New Deal. So it forever changes that. And it very much establishes, again, people might feel differently about if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but establishes this accepted belief that the government does have a responsibility to the economy, that the government has a responsibility to manage the economy to a degree. People would disagree about the degree of that. But the government has a moral responsibility to not just respond to these kind of things, but to try to prevent it, and to make sure that people are, people would disagree about the degree of it, but that there is some kind of responsibility the government has toward its citizens, particularly in economic crisis. We've seen that over the past 6 or 7 months, government reacted very quickly when everything went bad. There's arguments all over the place about what to do with it now, but there was an overwhelming support for that when it all happened. But that mentality and the acceptance of that is partially due to the New Deal, and it just brings about this concept that there's a minimum level of well-being for Americans that the government should promise. That public welfare, bank insurance, minimum wage, those are just kind of basic standard things that people ought to be provided with and that the government should protect. So it is quite revolutionary in a lot of ways, but it's also a little bit conservative in some ways too, in that it wasn't, total socialism, it wasn't total communism, any of those things. It did keep the major principles of capitalism intact. So Roosevelt kind of balances the two, or some people may not see it that way. But anyway, tomorrow we will look at those things that were going on in Europe that were distracting a lot of people from the New Deal and some of that stuff. So that's what we'll look at tomorrow, get some of that background. Here's what we should do now.